This is a story about a lie. A lie told to an entire army that their tanks were invincible and that their enemies' weapons were obsolete jokes. But on the battlefields of Vietnam, these soldiers were about to learn the truth from a gun they were taught to dismiss, a 90mm cannon that would shatter their world. This is the story of the 90mm truth. For Commander Le Duan, the lie was as real as the sweat and diesel fumes filling the inside of his T-54 tank. The world was a cacophony of sensation. The metallic scent of cosmoline and the hot, oily breath of the engine mingled with the ever-present odor of 4 unwashed men. As part of the North Vietnamese Army's 202nd Armored Regiment, he wiped a film of grime from the vision block of his cupola, his knuckles scraping against the rough cast steel. His home for the last 9 months had been this 10-foot-wide steel box, a space he shared with his gunner, his driver, and his loader. Below him, the crew moved with the practiced, claustrophobic grace of men who knew every bolt and weld mark by touch alone. Gunner Tran, a farm boy from the Red River Delta whose delicate hands seemed better suited for planting rice than guiding a 70-pound shell, hummed a revolutionary tune as he performed his daily ritual, polishing the massive breech of the main gun. For Tran, the D-10T cannon was an article of faith, a 100mm god of vengeance forged in the great factories of the Soviet Union. He could recite its specifications like scripture: maximum effective range of 4,000 meters, muzzle velocity of 900 meters per second, a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute with a skilled loader like Bao. This machine, their T-54, was the culmination of a legend. It was a direct descendant of the 34, the tank that had crushed the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Its design was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. The low, sloped profile made it a difficult target, designed to disappear into the folds of the earth or the dense jungle foliage. Its armor, over 200 millimeters thick on the turret face, was sloped at a 60-degree angle, a feature they were told made it immune to the pitifully small cannons of Western tanks. Their V12 diesel engine, while deafeningly loud, was a marvel of reliability, a rugged, dependable heart that had carried them hundreds of kilometers down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This journey south had been an epic undertaking, a testament to their resolve. They traveled only at night, in long, dispersed columns, moving under the triple-canopied jungle that hid them from the ever-present threat of American air power. During the day, they would lie silent in camouflaged hides, listening to the distant, terrifying thunder of B-52 arc-light strikes that shook the very ground, or the angry buzz of 4 phantoms hunting for targets. This constant threat from the sky had ironically hardened their conviction. The Americans were cowards who fought from a distance, unwilling to meet them on the ground, man to man, tank to tank. Their indoctrination, a constant process of lectures and reinforcement, solidified this belief. Every few days, a political officer would gather the crews. He was an older man with a thin mustache and an unshakable certainty in his eyes. He would unroll large, detailed charts of the enemy's main battle tank, the M48 Patton. "Look at this," he would say, his bamboo pointer tapping the tall, rounded silhouette. "A capitalist parade float. It stands nearly 10 feet tall. You will see it a kilometer before it sees you." He would mock its flat-sided hull, its massive bulbous turret. "Look at this armor. It is designed to impress politicians, not to stop a real socialist shell." The biggest laugh always came when he mentioned the engine. He would tell them stories, perhaps true, perhaps not, of early models in Korea that were powered by gasoline engines, earning them the nickname Ronsons from their own GI crews. After the popular cigarette lighter, because they always lit up on the first strike. The officer would pause for effect, letting the men absorb the image of their enemies being incinerated by their own flawed designs. "You are not fighting a mere tank," he would conclude, his voice ringing with ideological fervor. "You are fighting a symbol of a decadent, dying empire. It is a hollow shell, and you, comrades, are the hammer that will shatter it." So, why was this propaganda so devastatingly effective? It boiled down to 2 factors: information isolation and technological pride. For the NVA crews on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, there was no outside information to challenge the official narrative. Their entire world was the jungle, their comrades, and the words of their political officers. Secondly, the T-54 was a source of immense pride. It was a world-class piece of Soviet engineering, a tangible symbol of socialist power that they could see and touch. The idea that a clumsy-looking American tank could defeat it was not just a tactical miscalculation, it was an ideological impossibility, and they believed it. They studied the flawed recognition charts, memorizing weak points that did not exist and overlooking the true threats. They cleaned their guns and stacked their ammunition, armor-piercing capped, ballistic-capped shells for enemy tanks, high-explosive fragmentation for infantry and bunkers. They were confident, but it was the confidence of the ignorant, an assurance built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. They knew nothing of the M48A3 variant, the diesel-powered workhorse that now formed the backbone of American armor in Vietnam. They knew nothing of its 90mm M41 cannon, a gun they dismissed for its smaller caliber. And they knew absolutely nothing of the ammunition it fired, or the sophisticated stereoscopic rangefinder that guided it. Their mission was the culmination of this arrogant certainty. They were the steel spearhead of Operation Lam Son 719, a massive offensive designed to overrun the American firebase at Ben Het and break the defensive line in the Central Highlands. They were the unstoppable force, the physical embodiment of the revolution. They moved through the darkness toward their objective, an invisible armored fist, convinced that their courage and their superior Soviet steel were all they needed to achieve a glorious victory. We're going to break down exactly how this weapon worked and why it was so effective. If you love deep dives into military history that uncover the truth behind the propaganda, subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming. The pre-dawn air on March 3, 1969 was thick and wet, tasting of chlorophyll and damp earth. The incessant thrum of the jungle's nocturnal life was a wall of sound, a familiar blanket of noise that the tankers had grown accustomed to. Then, one by one, the sounds of nature were crushed by the roar of technology. Across the staging area, hidden under a dense canopy, dozens of V-12 diesel engines coughed to life, their low, guttural growl vibrating through the ground and into the bones of the men waiting inside their steel shells. The air grew heavy with the sharp, choking smell of exhaust. Inside his T-54, Commander Le Duan felt the familiar lurch as his driver, Min, a stoic farmer who drove the 40-ton machine with surprising gentleness, engaged the transmission. The tank crushed a thicket of bamboo as it moved into its attack formation, the long barrel of its main gun scything through the foliage. Through the narrow, green-tinted rectangle of his periscope, Le Duan could see the other tanks of his company emerging from the gloom like prehistoric beasts. Spectral shapes of dark steel against the slightly less dark jungle. Their coordination was precise, a deadly ballet they had practiced countless times. Infantry, young men with the determined faces of true believers, moved up to flank them, their AK-47s held at the ready, their B-40 rocket launchers slung over their shoulders. The battle began with thunder. A barrage of 120mm mortars and 75mm pack howitzers hidden miles away in Laos opened up on the firebase. The sky to the west flickered with distant light, and seconds later, the sound of the explosions rolled over them, a continuous, deafening roar. This was their curtain, the fire and smoke that would cover their advance. Forward! Le Duan commanded over the intercom, his voice tight with adrenaline. The tank surged ahead, joining a river of steel pouring out of the jungle. They smashed through the camp's outer perimeter of concertina wire and minefields with contemptuous ease, the engineers having cleared paths hours before. The initial resistance was exactly what they had expected: sporadic, panicked rifle and machine gun fire from the ARVN positions. The bullets sparked harmlessly against their armor, a swarm of angry wasps attacking a hornet. Gunner Tran traversed the turret, firing a high-explosive shell into a bunker, silencing a troublesome 50-caliber machine gun in a satisfying cloud of dirt and concrete. Their confidence, already high, swelled into a feeling of invincibility. It was happening. It was all happening exactly as the political officers had promised. The puppets of the American empire were breaking, fleeing in terror before the might of the People's Army. Then, as they crested a small rise overlooking the camp's dusty airstrip, They saw them. Silhouetted against the graying dawn sky and the fires from the barrage, 3 of them sat, waiting. M48 Pattons. They were just as the charts had depicted them, perhaps even more so. They were enormous, tall and broad, with a high, almost clumsy-looking profile. Their turrets were massive, rounded castings of steel. To Le Duan, they looked arrogant, fat with capitalist excess. He felt a surge of contempt. This was the great American beast they were so afraid of? It was a giant, waiting to be slain. He designated the lead Patton as the primary target. It was positioned perfectly, side on to them, a textbook shot. Gunner, armor, piercing, target, lead tank, range, 1,000 meters. He ordered, his voice, a model of professional calm. In the gunner's seat, Tran was already at work. His eye was pressed to the sight, his hands moving with fluid grace over the traverse and elevation wheels. Target acquired, his voice came back, steady and confident. He had loaded an armor-piercing ballistic capped shell, a 70-pound projectile of solid steel designed to punch through 14 centimeters of armor plate. At this range, against a stationary target, it was an almost guaranteed kill. "Fire," Le Duan commanded. The T-54 bucked violently, the massive recoil slamming the entire vehicle backward. The interior filled instantly with the acrid, metallic tang of burnt propellant, a smell of victory. For a brief, magical moment, Le Duan watched the faint orange tracer of the shell streak across the misty battlefield, a perfect line connecting his gun to the enemy's heart. He braced for the inevitable explosion. The shell struck the Patton's massive turret with a brilliant, blinding flash of white light. A direct hit. A cheer started to form in his throat, but the cheer died before it was born. There was no catastrophic explosion. There was no turret cartwheeling through the air. There was only a sound, a bizarre, deafening clang that seemed to violate the laws of physics, the sound of a giant sledgehammer striking a railway bell. The American tank visibly shuddered from the impact, and a puff of gray smoke erupted from the point where the shell had hit. But it did not die. It did not even catch fire. It just sat there for 2 or 3 seconds, as if gathering its thoughts. An impossible, terrifying stillness settled over the battlefield. And then, its long 90mm gun, which had been elevated slightly, began to lower. The massive turret, with an unnervingly smooth and quiet hum, began to turn towards them. So how could a smaller 90mm gun defeat a tank with 200mm of sloped armor? The answer wasn't about size, it was about chemistry. A blinding flash, a white-hot spear of light, erupted from the barrel of the distant M48 Patton. Le Duan never saw the shell. No one did. It was a phantom, a ghost of hypersonic velocity. He saw only the effect of its arrival. The T-54 on his left flank, commanded by his friend Nguyen, a man he had promised to share a bottle of rice wine with in Saigon, a man who had shown him a worn photograph of his young daughter just the night before, seemed to simply come apart. The impact wasn't the dull thud of a kinetic penetrator. It was a sharp, violent crack, like the universe splitting open. A jet of incandescent flame, brighter than the sun, shot 30 feet into the morning sky from the tank's open commander's hatch, followed by a thick, greasy column of black smoke. The massive 20-ton turret was lifted several inches off its ring by the force of the internal explosion, turning slightly before settling back down at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Le Duan, a veteran of a dozen firefights, had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just a kill, it was an annihilation. He was witnessing the brutal physics of a high-explosive anti-tank round. The heat shell didn't use brute force. It used chemistry and physics as a weapon. Its nose contained a meticulously shaped explosive charge, which, upon detonation, focused all of its energy into a tiny point, forging a needle-thin jet of molten copper that traveled forward at over 25,000 feet per second. This jet of liquid metal struck the armor not as a solid, but as a focused, superplasticized river of energy, punching through the thick Soviet steel as if it were cheesecloth. Once inside, it was a demon of destruction, a 3,000-degree whirlwind that flash vaporized the crew, ignited the fuel tanks, and detonated the ammunition storage. It was over in less than a single heartbeat. Before the horror of no one's death could fully register, Another M48 fired. Its target was the T-54 leading their column. Again, the result was instantaneous and absolute. The shell struck the front glacis plate, and in a shower of sparks, the unstoppable molten jet found its way through, turning the tank into another funeral pyre. The battle was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. The radio, only moments ago alive, with the confident cries of advancing units, became a gateway to hell. It was a screaming, chaotic mess of static, of panicked voices shouting about an invisible enemy, about magic bullets and fire cannons that consumed everything they touched. "We are burning. We are all burning." One voice shrieked before being cut off by a burst of static. "My gun is useless. The shells bounce off," cried another. Le Duan watched in a state of clinical shock as his proud company, the armored fist of the revolution, was systematically, effortlessly dismantled. Their own 100mm shells, the pride of Soviet artillery, were doing nothing. They sparked and whined off the Patton's thick, rounded turret and heavily sloped frontal armor, ricocheting harmlessly into the sky. Meanwhile, the American 90mm guns were firing with a calm, methodical, chilling precision. Each muzzle flash was a death sentence. The lies of the political officer, the flawed charts, the arrogant dismissal of the enemy, it all burned away in the fires of the destroyed tanks. This was not a clumsy, obsolete relic. This was a predator. And they had stumbled, blind and ignorant, into its killing ground. They were learning, in the most violent way possible, about the M48A3's M13A1 stereoscopic rangefinder. It was a piece of optical technology so far beyond their own that it might as well have been magic. The American gunner didn't have to guess the range or bracket his shots. He looked through his sight, saw two images, and turned a dial until they converged into one clear picture. The range, to within 10 meters, was instantly laid onto his gun. His first shot was a killing shot, every time. The 90mm gun they had mocked was not just a gun, it was a complete weapons system, firing advanced ammunition that made a mockery of their superior armor. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over Le Duan. The psychological shockwave that ripped through him was more devastating than any physical blow. His training was useless. His tank was a D-trap. His ideology was a shield made of paper. Everything he had believed, everything he had been told, was a catastrophic lie. The 90mm truth was a brutal lesson. What other unbeatable weapon system in history was proven tragically wrong on the battlefield? Let us know your top example in the comments below. The order to retreat was a desperate, panicked cry over the radio from a battalion commander who was watching his entire unit being erased from existence. For Le Duan, it was a release from the paralysis of shock. "Men, reverse! Back into the trees, now!" he screamed into the intercom. The T-54 lurched backward, its transmission whining in protest. The withdrawal was a chaotic, terrifying scramble for survival. They were no longer hunters, they were prey, fleeing a killing field that was littered with the smoldering, silent husks of their comrades' tanks. Each wreck was a monument to their own folly. The air was thick with the smell of burning diesel, melting rubber, and the sickeningly sweet odor of cooked human flesh, a smell that would haunt Le Duan's dreams for the rest of his life. He saw men, their uniforms on fire, tumbling from the hatches of their stricken tanks, running blindly before collapsing. He forced himself to look away, to focus on survival. They used the smoke from the burning wrecks as a screen, their driver skillfully maneuvering them back toward the relative safety of the jungle's edge. Of the 10 tanks in his company that had charged out of the trees with such revolutionary fervor less than 30 minutes ago, only 3 made it back. The rest were silent, blackened steel coffins, their crews entombed within, their red stars scorched black under the indifferent Vietnamese Sunday. That night, the survivors huddled in a makeshift camp, the adrenaline of battle replaced by the heavy, oppressive weight of shock and grief. The faces of the men were hollow, their eyes staring into the middle distance, replaying the horror they had witnessed. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the face of modern industrial warfare and been found wanting. The political officer, who had so confidently predicted a swift and glorious victory, was conspicuously absent. In his place were grim-faced regimental commanders and intelligence officers, their notebooks filled with the desperate, disjointed testimonies of the survivors. The official explanation, disseminated for the sake of morale, was that they had fallen into a brilliantly laid American ambush, that the enemy had hidden anti-tank guns of a new type. But the tankers knew the truth. They hadn't been ambushed. They hadn't been outfought. They had been outclassed. In the days that followed, the process of relearning began. Le Duan and the other surviving commanders and gunners were subjected to intense debriefings. They drew maps in the dirt, recreating the battle second by second. They argued, they shouted, they tried to make sense of the incomprehensible. A new, terrifying picture of the M48 Patton began to emerge. Its 90mm gun was not just powerful, it was unnaturally accurate. Its armor was not weak, it was a complex, rounded casting that was masterful at deflecting kinetic energy shells. Its crew was not soft, they were calm, professional, and deadly efficient. Their entire doctrine, the Soviet model of massed armored assault, was useless against this new reality. It was suicide. The realization settled in slowly, a cold dread that extinguished the last embers of their ideological fire. They had to change. They had to forget everything they had been taught and learn a new way to fight. The process was painful, born from humiliation and a burning desire for revenge. They created sand tables, using rocks to represent the pattens and twigs for their own tanks. They practiced new tactics. No more head-on charge. No more long-range duels. Their T-54's greatest asset, they now realized, was not its gun or its armor, but its low profile. It was a tool for concealment. They would become ambush predators. They would use the jungle as their primary weapon, hiding their tanks so completely that the enemy would not see them until it was far too late. They analyzed the data from the battle, determining the effective range of their own gun against the Patton's weaker side and rear armor. The magic number was 500 meters. Inside that range, their 100mm cannon could be lethal. Their new doctrine was simple. Let the enemy come to them, lure them into a prepared kill zone, and most importantly, they learned the value of combined arms. They began training intensively with infantry units armed with RPG-7s. The infantry would become the bait, or the flanking force, that would distract the Pattons while the T-54s maneuvered for a killing shot. It was the beginning of a long, painful transformation from soldiers of doctrine to students of war. Months later, under the pale, watery light of a hunter's moon, the final exam was administered. For 6 agonizingly long and silent hours, Le Duan's T-54 lay motionless in a dense thicket of bamboo, and wait a minute, vines that clawed at its hull. It was less a tank and more a part of the landscape. Every inch of its steel hide was covered in a meticulously constructed blanket of foliage, its cannon disguised as a fallen log. The engine was cold, the electronics off. Inside, the 4-man crew sat in near-total darkness, breathing shallowly, communicating only with hand signals. The only sound was the frantic beating of Le Duan's own heart and the incessant drone of insects outside. This was their new reality. The glorious, sweeping charges were a thing of the past. Now, war was about patience, about enduring the suffocating heat, the biting insects, and the crushing tension of the weight. They were hunters now, and the jungle was their snare. The intelligence extracted from a captured ARVN officer was solid. A 2-tank American patrol from the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment made a reconnaissance run down this stretch of Route 14 twice a week. Today was the day. Further down the road, hidden in spider holes and behind ancient banyan trees, 2 squads of infantry clutched their RPG-7 launchers, their role critical. They were the second blow, tasked with engaging the trail tank the moment the first one was hit. If you believe stories like this are crucial for understanding the realities of war, share this video with someone who appreciates in-depth history. Spreading this knowledge helps keep these incredible stories alive. Then, a new sound intruded upon the jungle's symphony. It started as a faint vibration felt through the soles of their boots, a low thrum that grew steadily into the unmistakable, metallic squeak and clatter of an M48's tracks. The sound was terrifyingly loud in the stillness. Le Duan felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but this time it was different. It was cold, controlled. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, a whetstone that sharpened his senses. Through a narrow, carefully cut firing slit in the camouflage, he saw it. The first Patton lumbered into view, a 10-foot-tall monster of olive-drab steel. Its commander was visible in the open hatch, a small, dark figure scanning the dense jungle walls on either side of the road with binoculars. The tank moved with a slow, ponderous caution, but it was the caution of the powerful, the unease of a predator in unfamiliar territory, not the fear of prey. It crawled into their pre-sighted kill zone, a small natural clearing 500 meters from their position. For a fatal second, it offered its flank, a flat, vertical plate of steel just below the turret ring. It was a perfect target. Target, Le Duan whispered into his throat microphone, the sound barely audible even to himself. Fire when ready. Gunner Tran did not need to be told twice. His eye had been pressed to his sight for an hour, his muscles aching from the strain. He had been tracking the tank since the moment it appeared, his hands on the traverse and elevation wheels, his movements imperceptible. The crosshairs were steady, locked onto the point of aim. He took a breath, held it, and squeezed the firing trigger. The roar of the 100mm cannon was an unholy cataclysm in the silent jungle, a thunderclap that shattered the peace. The tank bucked, and the world outside the firing slit was momentarily obscured by smoke and flying leaves. The armor-piercing shell, fired from this optimal range against the Patton's vulnerable side, performed flawlessly. It struck with a flash of white-hot energy, punching through the 4 inches of steel as if it were plywood. A split second later, the tank's internal ammunition storage cooked off. A massive, secondary explosion ripped the M48 apart from the inside, the huge turret lifting clean off the hull and tumbling onto the road in a ball of fire. It was a perfect shot. A perfect kill. But there was no time for celebration, no room for triumph. The second Patton, 50 meters behind the first, reacted with terrifying speed. Its turret was already turning toward their muzzle flash before the sound of their own shot had faded. Le Duan saw the flash from its 90mm cannon and screamed, "Brace!" The incoming round, an armor, piercing discarding sabot, hit their frontal glacis plate with the force of a meteor. Their sloped armor, their one true advantage, saved their lives. The shell's tungsten core was deflected, shrieking off into the jungle. But the sheer kinetic energy transfer was unimaginable. It felt as if the entire tank had been picked up and slammed into a concrete wall. The lights went out, the engine died. Inside, a shower of white-hot metal flakes, spall-sheared from the interior wall by the force of the impact blasted through the crew compartment. Min screamed as a piece of the deadly shrapnel tore through his leg. They were alive, but they were crippled, blind, and helpless, a steel coffin waiting for a final, killing blow. Outside, the jungle erupted in a storm of noise, the distinct thump-whoosh of their infantry's RPGs, the roar of explosions, and the chattering of machine guns. The battle was over in less than a minute. They had done it. Their new doctrine worked. But as they sat in the darkness, the smell of their driver's blood thick in the air, Le Duan felt no victory, only the cold, hard certainty that every battle from now on would be fought on this knife's edge between survival and annihilation. The 90mm truth had taught them not how to win, but how to endure. The NVA tankers learned to survive against the Patton, but the Americans were already looking to the future. They were developing a radical new tank, one with a turbine engine and revolutionary composite armor that would once again change the rules of armored warfare entirely. But the story of the Moan Abrams is a tale for another time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a little-known aspect of the Vietnam War. If you enjoyed this look at the truth behind the propaganda, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. We'll see you in the next one.